Christians have found an unlikely ally in Russia. Vladimir Putin has affirmed his commitment to bring in peace and stability to his country, including safeguarding its Christian communities and heritage. Our Bridge City News contributor, Michael Coren, joins me now from Toronto. Now, Michael, should this come as a bit of a surprise that Christians have Russia as an ally?
Well, let's qualify this a little bit, because there's a danger of Christians seeing Putin as a friend. And I've noticed this on social media, especially when Barack Obama was in power. They would juxtapose Obama with Putin and say Putin is an Orthodox Christian and believes in the faith, and Obama doesn't. That was a misreading. Whatever your views, Obama actually is a Christian who has a deep interest in theology. But putting that aside, Putin is a dictatorial figure. Russia is oppressive. People are murdered because of their views. They've interfered in foreign elections, as we know. So let's not think of Putin as a model Christian. However, there is a commitment, I suppose, particularly to the Orthodox practice of Christianity, Eastern Orthodoxy. Russia is one of the great parts of the Eastern Orthodox Church. We think of Greek Orthodoxy as well, of course. And so they do feel a solidarity for Christians, particularly in the Middle East. Many Middle Eastern Christians are Greek or Russian Orthodox. I mean, they're interchangeable. Greek Orthodox means Orthodox. So if we think of the Christians of Iraq and Syria, there are some who are Catholic Maronite. There are some other denominations, but the vast majority are Orthodox. And there is this sense of fraternity, of brotherhood between Russia and the greater Orthodox Church. I just want to give a little bit of context about the persecution of Christians, because we hear about it sometimes. There'll be a terrible attack. I have some shrapnel and shell casing I picked up from a church in Iraq where Christians were slaughtered by an Islamist mob. But remember, the Islamist fanatics kill everybody. There was recently a mosque in Sinai where hundreds of innocent Muslims were murdered, Bedouin, because they supported the government. But Christians are persecuted terribly, particularly in parts of the Islamic world, but also in North Korea and China. Now, in most of the world, it's not too bad at all. And in North America, I know people think they face problems, but don't call it persecution, because there are many parts of the world where simply to go to a church, you can put your life at risk. Nigeria is problematic, not all of it, but parts of it. So Russia giving some support, look, I'll take it wherever it is given, wherever it's offered. I wouldn't choose Russia to be my ally, but if Putin and his people are saying we will help protect Christians abroad, I'll accept it.
Now, the hashtag Stand Together has been making the rounds on social media, including the Embassy of Armenia. Now, Michael, are Armenians throwing their support of Christians in their firm commitment to the defense of religious freedom? Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, they are, but Armenia always has. Armenia is the place for some of the earliest Christianity. I am fascinated, I'm sure you are too, by the foundations of the Christian church, and Armenia was one of the epicenters of it. And of course, Armenians suffered an attempted genocide at the hands of the Turks during the First World War. Now, I couldn't even say this in certain places, and to say that in Turkey could get me into all sorts of trouble. But Armenian Christians were massacred, huge numbers. In fact, Adolf Hitler later said, "Who remembers the Armenians now?" before he started the Shoah, the Holocaust of the Jewish people. And the Turks deny this, many of them, and they particularly deny it was a religious issue. Well, it was. The victims were Christian, and those committing the atrocities were Muslim. I'm not blaming Islam for this. I'm blaming the Turkish administration for what happened. So the Armenians understand this. They understand what massacre and persecution is like. And yes, they have certainly thrown support behind Christians abroad. It's not a very powerful country, but God bless them for so doing.
The Iraqi Archbishop is also championing awareness of persecuted Christians in the Middle East. Since June of 2014, ISIS has driven out more than 500,000 Christians out of Mosul.
Yeah. Now, just a bit of history on this, because I'm not taking any political sides here, but Christians in Iraq and Syria were actually treated relatively well. Now, Saddam Hussein was a monster, but Tariq Aziz, his foreign minister, was a Christian. I don't think he was a man who had a personal relationship with Christ, but I think he was a tribal Christian. Saddam did not persecute Christians as such. If they were politically problematic, they were persecuted. But he actually was far more controlling of Islamic fundamentalism than of Christianity. It was divide and conquer, if you like. I mean, I'm not naive here. I understand what was going on. But Christians under Saddam in Iraq and Christians under Assad in Syria simply don't face the persecution they do, for example, in other parts of the Arab world. When those governments, let's say the Iraqi government was destabilized, anarchy filled the vacuum. And within that anarchy was huge persecution of Christians. ISIS were the most severe. They're satanic, in my opinion. But even before ISIS, there was persecution of Christians because the central power was removed. Iraq was 10, maybe even 15% Christian at one point. This is the homeland, the heartland of the original Christianity. I hate to say this, but we're probably looking at a region now, a country now, where Christianity will effectively no longer exist.
Now, a story from the UK publication Express says Christians are the most persecuted religious group in the world and could be wiped out of Iraq within 3 years, according to a report by a Catholic charity. Is it really that dire, Michael?
Yeah, I think it is. I'm always very wary of hyperbole and rhetoric because it's very dangerous to truth and to Christian truth. But as I mentioned earlier, in Iraq, I think we're looking at a country that there'll be Christian, but not many. It'll be very hard to maintain churches and parishes and congregations. And it's understandable. It's partly their faith. It's also Christians tended to be relatively well educated, more international links perhaps than others in their country. And I can fully understand. We have no right to say they have to stay. They're frightened of their lives. They're frightened for the future of their children. They're leaving for other countries. I've heard Christians plead with them, please stay and make sure Christianity continues. I would never have the audacity to say that. Thank God my family are not at risk every day. So I do understand why they are leaving. And I don't actually think Iraq can be properly repaired. There is still hope in many parts of the world, but to rebuild the infrastructure of Iraq, to provide stability, there are many, many Muslims in Iraq who want the Christians to stay. There are many Arabs who will say to you, I can't imagine an Arab world without Christianity. The idea that everyone in the Arab world wants to remove Christianity is simply not true. But it's going to be a very difficult one in Iraq in particular. And if that happens, it will spill over to a large extent into Syria and elsewhere.
Now, Michael, we can't forget as well about the persecution of Christians in many regions of Africa, including the threat from Boko Haram in Nigeria.
Yeah. Well, Nigeria is an interesting country because it's pretty much divided between Muslim and Christian. And to a very large extent, they've coexisted peacefully. In major cities, you'd barely know that there was a difference. I mean, there really is a coexistence. I'm not being overly optimistic here. But in certain states in the north, Sharia law was imposed. Now, I can tell you that the first people to oppose this were more moderate mainstream Muslim. They were murdered immediately. So there's a common enemy here, and there's moderation in all religions. And after that, other groups came in, and many members of terrorist groups in Nigeria aren't even Nigerian, and they're trying to destabilize. And the government is trying to fight them. Muslim leaders are trying to fight them and prevent this, but it is continuing. However, in Nigeria, I think there are a sufficient number of Christians and enough organization and goodwill from Muslims in the country that there won't be a Christian exodus. But there is a great deal of suffering. It breaks my heart.
So how much of a stronghold does Boko Haram have in many countries throughout Africa? Is it spreading like a cancer, like Nigeria and other countries as well?
No, I mean, Nigeria is a large country with a large population, and it is there. There are other terrorist groups. I mean, they're variations on a theme, you know, they all have the same fanatical ideology, but they are being defeated in Africa. They don't have very much support. See, sometimes what happens, no, I'm not comparing the two, but if you take a group like Hezbollah in Lebanon, and I'm not comparing Hezbollah to ISIS, they're simply not the same sort of thing, but Hezbollah also has a social welfare infrastructure. It helps people find education and employment. Now, and would be foolish to deny that. When you do that, there are Christians in Lebanon who support Hezbollah because it's more than just an armed organization. These groups in Africa are purely violent. They kidnap, hold for ransom, they destroy, they are sadistic. So they have very little popular support. But at the same time, if people are sufficiently frightened, they will lend their grudging agreement, if you like, to any sort of terrorist group.
Now, meanwhile, over in Pakistan, that government is surrendering to the demands of an Islamic extremist group that is jeopardizing the last chances for a Christian mom to overturn her death sentence for blasphemy. Tell me a bit about that.
Now, Pakistan is a different issue because in Pakistan, we have a government that is weak. We have blasphemy laws. We have oppression and suppression of all minorities. In fact, Sikhs in many ways have suffered even more than Christians. But Christians in Pakistan were traditionally very patriotic. Christians were revered in Pakistan. In fact, the political class, the establishment, wanting their children to be highly educated, sent their kids to Christian schools. Similarly, Jewish people were revered in Pakistan. This hatred is fairly recent. This wasn't the dream originally of the founders of Pakistan. But Islamism has become very powerful in Pakistan, and the government has generally been very weak. There have been leaders of Pakistan who've spoken out against blasphemy laws and persecution of Christians. They've been murdered, they've been assassinated. And here we have another example of someone who innocently makes a comment or goes to draw water from a well that was apparently preserved for Muslims, and they're charged with blasphemy. And often what the government does, it doesn't execute people for blasphemy. What it does is it will release them to the mob. So rather, they will wash their hands. Where have we seen that before? They will say, we're not going to execute anyone for blasphemy. We've arrested them, but we're not going to execute them. Off they go, knowing the mob will lynch them, will murder them. And it's happening time and time again. And what really disappoints me, if we juxtapose India and Pakistan, India, this huge country on the border, there is some persecution in India, but by and large in India, I mean, we have Kerala, we have Goa, we have Christian areas. There is no intolerance. Muslims in India, there are more Muslim millionaires in India than in Pakistan, the Islamic State. There's more freedom for Muslims in India generally than in Pakistan. And Christians are suffering terribly. They're often undereducated, illiterate. They're denied any decent job. So they have jobs such as cleaning the sewers, cleaning the toilets, and so on. It's a terrible persecution.
Well, let me ask you about China. I'm hearing conflicting reports. You know, on one hand, I hear these beautiful, amazing, big churches that are opening up in Beijing and Shanghai. And then on another report I hear is that, no, it's the church is still going underground because of the persucution. What are you hearing about what's taking place over in Asia and China?
It's a very interesting question, actually, and the way you phrased it is very perceptive because, look, China is no longer really a communist nation. China is post-communist. China is motivated by profit. And I'm studying for a Master's of Divinity right now. I have Chinese students with me. They travel freely, they practice their faith. So the idea that China is a country where Christians are rounded up and disappear, that isn't true. What China is about, though, is control. And if they think Christians are a political problem, they will infiltrate the church, they may close down the church. And what has happened is the underground church has developed where Christians simply don't want any government intervention at all. So it's difficult to get this one right. There are many, I think there are tens and tens of millions of Christians about to come forward when communism finally falls. At the moment, one can be Christian in China, practice faith, even be welcomed by the government. But if a Christian shows that they are perhaps preaching against the government, have an alternative point of view, that church will be closed down and will go underground.
Yeah, the persecution of Christians continues around the world. Michael Coren, one of our BCN contributors, joining me from Toronto. Thank you so much, Michael.
Pleasure being, not a pleasant subject, but a pleasure being with you.